A simple shop scooter like this one can make it much easier to access tools that you don't use all the time and free up a lot of space, especially in a small shop. They just roll out and roll back away when you don't need them. Today, I'm going to show you how to make one of these simple shop scooters and customize it for whatever you want to use it for. Having good storage solutions will make your shop cleaner, safer, and more enjoyable to work in. Today, we're going to build a quick shop scooter that will take about half a day and install it underneath this table to hold both my sander and my air compressor. After taking a couple of quick rough measurements underneath the table to get an idea of the size of the space, I moved over to the miter saw where I quickly chopped down some 2x4s to just some rough sizes. I'm using pine 2x4s for this project because, well, they're cheap and they look pretty good if you do a little milling to them. I rough cut these oversized because I am going to clean these up and do some milling on them. But if you're going to skip that step, you can just cut these down to the final dimensions that will fit your space. Milling down the wood is not necessary for this project, but it will make your project look nicer and cleaner. It'll also give you a little practice with your tools, and it will take some of the twists and turns out of the lumber that will make it easier to assemble later. After flattening down one face and one edge on the jointer, I moved on over to the planer and planed the boards down so that they were a consistent thickness. I wound up planing my boards down to about 1.25 inches by 3 inches. This allowed me to mill off the rounded edges that come from store-bought 2x4s and give them nice, sharp, clean lines. But I left the lumber thick enough to provide the structural support that I'll need in the final project. Now that the lumber's all milled, I can cut it down to final size. Now for my project, I'm going to use miter joints, so I'm cutting everything at 45-degree angles, but you could just as easily use butt joints or some other joinery as long as you can join these 4 pieces together to make the box that will form the base of your scooter. I'm going to route a 3/8 inch groove into each of the outer frame pieces, and this is going to hold the 3/4 inch plywood that will form the platform of the scooter. I also stuck a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood between the bit and the fence to put a 3/4 offset between the top of the groove and the top of the frame. Pine is pretty soft, so I was able to do this in one single pass. I used my router table for this, but you can cut this groove using any method you want. It could be a handheld router or even use your table saw if that works for you. Next up is to cut down the plywood platform, and to cut the length of the plywood, I'm going to use my track saw because the length of the plywood was just too big for my tiny little table saw. I dry assembled 3 sides and slid the plywood in, and then I marked out where the width of the plywood should be. This time I used the table saw just to show a different way of cutting the plywood, and also the bed on the table saw was wide enough to fit this width this time, but I could have just as easily used a track saw to make this cut as well. With all the cuts complete, it was time to do the final dry fit to make sure that all those mitered corners lined up the way I wanted them to and that it looked nice and neat. I'm going to jump in here just to let everyone know that I will provide links to all the materials and tools I used in the links below. Some of these are affiliate links, so if you need some of this stuff and you feel like buying it through our channel, thanks for supporting us, and now we'll go back to the build. The final test before glue up was just to make sure everything was square, and to do this I just popped on a couple of clamps to hold everything in place and then brought out my square. Once everything looked good, it was time to start the glue up. With the glue dry and the clamps off, it was time to start thinking about how to put on the wheels. I made these cross struts from some spare 2x6 I had, and I glued them in place. I also offset them from the edge just a little bit using a piece of 2x4. And the reason I did that is so that the wheels, when they spin, I could reach the locks from the front of the scooter, but when it spun around, it didn't impede the scooter from rolling in or out from underneath the table. Because of the shape of the scooter walls and the offsets, it was a little difficult to clamp this down. In hindsight, I probably should have just screwed the piece of wood down to the plywood. I'm going to be pulling on the scooter probably while being distracted by other things, so I wanted to make sure there were no sharp edges or splinters that could catch my fingers. I just took my trim router, put in a 1/4 inch round over bit, and I just went around all the sides, making sure that they were nice and smooth. On the inside edge of the bottom, I couldn't use the router because the struts got in the way of the ball bearing, so I just used a piece of sandpaper there to break those edges. For the top, I was able to use the trim router and the round over bit to go over both the inside and the outside edges of the whole platform. And I'll probably be grabbing the top more than the bottom, so having these smoother textures on the top are really more important than the bottom edges. As a final detail, I rounded over the mitered corners of this project. Now, this is going to make it less likely that as I'm rolling this in and out of different spaces that I cause any breakage on the corners or tear off any pieces of wood that might splinter. And now it's time for some final sanding. Even though this is shop furniture, finishing is an important part of the process as it will add a lot of durability to the final project. But it's also a good time to test things out and try things you normally wouldn't do on a project where if it doesn't turn out exactly the way you expect it to, it's not that big of a deal. So in this case, I'm testing out some Rubio Fumed that I had a sample bottle of. Fumed is a color treatment, which means it only changes the color of the wood. It doesn't apply any protection. So I will have to follow this up with a more protective finish, but I wanted to see what it looked like on the birch plywood and also on the frame, which is either pine or fir or some variety of that, to see if this would be any use on future projects. After giving the product a few hours to react and do its thing, you can see that it really darkened down some of the grain on the birch plywood, but its effect on the outer frame was minimal. With that experiment complete, it was time to apply some real protection, and for this, I'm going to spray on some Lacquer by Deft, and this is the semi-gloss clear, and I'm just going to put 2 coats on the bottom, letting it thoroughly dry between coats before putting the wheels on. Attaching the wheels is a very straightforward and quick process. Just lay the wheels down where you want them to line up, then mark the areas with a center punch where you'll pre-drill for the screws. Once that's done, you can remove the wheels and then use the center punch as a guide for your drill for the pre-drilling, and then use the included hardware to screw down all 4 wheels. It's time to flip the scooter over on its wheels for the first time, and now you can actually see pretty good what that Rubio pre-treat color did to the birch plywood. A few more coats of lacquer to protect the top surfaces of the scooter, and it is ready to deploy in the shop. Well, that wraps up another video. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. And I'll see you again on the next project.